Dear listener, tonight we begin a journey into one of the most luminous and tragic lives ever told, the life of Joan of Arc. She was born a peasant girl in a small French village, yet within a few short years she stood at the heart of a kingdom's fate. She claimed to hear voices from heaven, led armies into battle, saw her king crowned, and died in fire at 19. Saint, warrior, heretic, martyr, her name has carried across centuries, not only in history but in myth, in art, in film, in song. But before she became all these things, she was simply a child, born in Domrémy, a rural village on the borderlands of France. It was the early 15th century, and her country was broken by the 100 Years' War. France was fractured. The English occupied large territories, the Burgundians allied with them, while the Dauphin Charles, uncrowned, clung to a weakened claim. This was the world into which Joan was born, a world of war and uncertainty, where even peasants in distant villages felt the tremors of kingdoms. The girl herself was known as Jehanne. She was born around 1412, daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romay. Her family was not rich, but they were not the poorest. They farmed, kept livestock, lived under the rhythm of fields and seasons. Witnesses from her later rehabilitation trial described her as dutiful, pious, and hard-working. She spun wool, helped in the fields, went to church often. There is little to suggest that anyone foresaw the extraordinary role she would one day play. And yet, dear listener, when we think of Joan of Arc, what images come to mind? Perhaps we see her in shining armor, sword raised, leading armies in banners and flame. Perhaps we see her with a crown of fire, as in the silent film The Passion of Joan of Arc by Carl Theodor Dreyer, 1928, where close-ups of her face capture a soul aflame. Or perhaps we see the warrior maiden played by Milla Jovovich in The Messenger, the story of Joan of Arc, 1999, full of fury and vision, a young woman tormented and exalted. These are powerful images, but they are not the beginning. The truth from the voices of those who knew her is quieter. Jehanne of Domrémy was remembered as modest, gentle, kind. She loved to pray at the village church. She had little education, perhaps none at all in reading or writing. She was not raised as a prodigy of war, but as a child of the fields. Dear listener, pause and reflect. Do you see the contrast? In art, in cinema, in memory, Joan is often shown as already aflame, already chosen, already burning with destiny. But in truth, destiny often begins in silence. The fields of Domrémy, the toll of church bells, the simple faith of a peasant girl, these were the soil in which her story grew. What else do we know of her youth? During her rehabilitation trial, decades after her death, villagers testified. They remembered her as unusually devout, often found at prayer. They recalled her generosity to the poor, her seriousness of spirit. She was not ordinary, but neither was she yet miraculous. These memories suggest that what later came, the voices, the mission, the crown, arose not from spectacle, but from a girl whose heart was already inclined to faith and to purpose. And so, the child of Domrémy grew. Outside her village, kingdoms clashed. The 100 Years' War had raged for decades. Armies marched, castles fell. The English pressed deeper into France. The Dauphin Charles remained uncrowned, his legitimacy questioned, his cause weakening. For the villagers, this war meant not only politics, but danger. Raids, shifting borders, fear of soldiers passing through. The fracture of a nation was felt even in the quietest corners. This, dear listener, was the world of Jehanne's childhood, a small life in a great storm, a quiet heart in a restless age. And from this soil would grow a voice that claimed to be divine, a mission that would defy kings, and a destiny that would end in fire. As we close this chapter, let us hold the image not of the warrior maiden yet, but of the child, a girl who prayed in Domrémy, who listened to the bells, who knew the rhythm of fields and seasons. For only when we remember her beginnings can we feel the full wonder of what came after. Next, dear listener, we will hear of the voices, the mysterious call that Joan claimed changed her life forever. Were they divine messengers, as she believed, or visions born of a troubled time and mind? We will listen to the testimony, to the chronicles, and to the way art and cinema have imagined those voices. History often turns on moments that seem small at first. For Joan of Arc, it was not a coronation, nor a battlefield, nor even a trial. It was a voice. She was about 13 years old, she later testified, when she first heard what she called the voice of God's messenger. In the quiet fields of Domrémy, tending her father's flock, she heard words that no one else heard, and saw light that no one else saw. From her trial records, we know how she described these encounters. Asked under oath what she had experienced, she said simply, "At the age of 13, I heard a voice from God to help me govern myself, and the first time I was very much afraid." Over and over, she spoke of the voices accompanied by a great light. Later, she named them Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These figures, she said, guided her, urged her to protect France, to raise the siege of Orléans, to lead the Dauphin to his rightful coronation. Her words in the transcripts are striking in their modesty. She did not describe grand visions of angels descending from the sky or burning bushes in the fields. She spoke of a voice, of light, of saints she recognized. It was not spectacle, but intimacy, as though heaven had whispered into the ear of a peasant girl. Dear listener, pause and reflect. How often do we imagine divine callings as thunder, as lightning, as overwhelming force? Yet Joan described hers as voice and light, persistent and insistent, but not theatrical. For her, the wonder lay not in the spectacle, but in the certainty it gave. And yet, art and cinema have rarely been content with such quiet. In Dreyer's silent masterpiece, The Passion of Joan of Arc, 1928, Joan's visions are shown in close-up, her face luminous, her eyes lifted, a soul aflame. In Luc Besson's The Messenger, the story of Joan of Arc, 1999, the voices are dramatized as terrifying apparitions, haunting her, pushing her into torment. These portrayals are powerful, but they amplify what Joan herself described simply. The real Joan in court said again and again, "The voices spoke to me. They told me to be good, to go to church, and later to save France." Historians have wrestled with these testimonies for centuries. Were the voices divine, as Joan believed, or were they visions born of psychology, of stress, of adolescence in a time of war? Some scholars have suggested she may have experienced temporal lobe epilepsy or hallucinations linked to mental illness. Others argue that such diagnoses diminish the sincerity of her faith, imposing modern categories on medieval experiences. For Joan herself, there was no doubt. The voices were real, and they gave her courage and purpose. We must remember, too, that Joan's age and setting magnify the strangeness. She was a teenage girl, illiterate, from a peasant family. To claim that archangels spoke to her was extraordinary, yet the villagers who later testified at her rehabilitation trial remembered her as unusually devout, serious, trustworthy. To them, her claims may not have seemed madness, but mystery. In a deeply religious age, visions were not alien but part of the fabric of life. Saints and angels were believed to intervene, to guide, to call. Joan's voices fit into a worldview that accepted divine encounter as possible. And still, dear listener, the paradox remains. A girl in a village claimed to hear saints. Within a few years, she would lead armies and confront kings. Whether we see her voices as divine or psychological, their power is undeniable. They transformed a peasant child into a figure who could stand before nobles and not falter, who could walk onto battlefields and inspire soldiers hardened by war. Consider the words recorded in her trial. When asked about her visions, she did not tremble, did not recant. She said, "I saw them with my bodily eyes as plainly as I see you. When they departed, I wept, and I wished they had taken me with them." These are not the words of invention, but of longing. She spoke not only of command, but of comfort. The voices were not just orders, they were companions. Imagine, dear listener, Joan at 13 in the fields of Domrémy. The wind rustles the grass, the bells of the church toll faintly in the distance. Suddenly light surrounds her and a voice speaks. Afraid at first, she listens. The voice tells her to be good, to trust God, to prepare for a mission. She does not yet know what it means. She only knows that her life will never again be the same. In pop culture, this moment is often painted with grandeur, but the truth, in her own words, is subtler and perhaps more profound. For Joan, the miracle was not thunder or lightning, but the quiet conviction that heaven had spoken. Dear listener, reflect once more. Whether we believe her voices were saints or symptoms, we cannot deny the effect. They gave her certainty, courage, and destiny. They propelled her from Domrémy to Orléans, from obscurity to legend. They are the hinge of her story. As we close this chapter, let us hold the paradox gently. Joan's voices were both simple and extraordinary, both intimate and world-changing. They remain mysterious, beyond proof, beyond dismissal. And yet, they shaped history. Next, we will step into the larger stage, France in crisis. To understand why a peasant girl could become so important, we must understand the world she entered. A kingdom fractured by the 100 Years' War, desperate for hope, where the voices of a teenage girl could change the course of nations. Dear listener, before Joan of Arc could rise, we must understand the world into which she was called. For her voices did not send her into a time of peace, but into a kingdom broken, weary, and divided. France in the early 15th century was not a single nation united under a crown, but a fractured land in the grip of the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War had begun long before Joan was born. In 1337, the kings of England and France had clashed over claims to the French throne. What followed was not one continuous war, but a century of campaigns, truces, betrayals, and shifting fortunes. By Joan's youth, the English had gained the upper hand. Their armies had triumphed at great battles like Agincourt in 1415, where English longbowmen devastated French knights. They occupied northern France, including Paris itself. In this chaos, the French crown was contested. The rightful heir, Charles VII, known as the Dauphin, was disinherited by the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which recognized the English king Henry V and his heirs as rulers of France. Henry V married Catherine of Valois, daughter of the French king, sealing the pact. When Henry V died suddenly in 1422, his infant son Henry VI was proclaimed king of both England and France. Meanwhile, Charles VII still claimed the throne, supported by loyalists in the south and center of the country. France then was not one but two. The north and Paris lay in English and Burgundian hands. The south and interior clung to Charles VII. Armies ravaged the land, fields were burned, peasants fled, cities fell. It was in this shattered world that Joan grew. Her village of Domrémy lay near the frontier between Loyalist and Burgundian territory, often threatened by raids. Even in her childhood, she saw soldiers pass through, burning and pillaging. Dear listener, pause and reflect. Imagine living in such a time. Your land is not your own, your king is disputed, your fields are at the mercy of armies. Fear is constant, hope is scarce. In such a world, could not the voices of a young girl seem like a miracle? To the French loyalists, Charles VII was their rightful king, but he was weak, hesitant, plagued by doubt. He had not yet been crowned. For Reims, the traditional coronation city of French kings, lay in enemy hands. Without that sacred rite, his legitimacy was fragile. The English and their allies mocked him as the King of Bourges, ruler only of a fragment of France. The cause seemed nearly lost. This is the France into which Joan entered. When she claimed that God had sent her to raise the siege of Orléans and lead Charles to his coronation, it was not a minor promise. Orléans was the key. Besieged by the English, it was the gateway to the south. If Orléans fell, Charles's position would collapse. If it was saved, his cause would revive. In popular culture, films often show France as a land of castles and knights, of dramatic battles and noble kings. And yes, there were castles, knights, and battles. But the deeper truth was fragmentation and despair. Charles was not yet the king of romance. He was a man hiding unsure, waiting for a sign. The people did not see their nation as whole, but as torn, uncertain whether it would survive. Joan's arrival must be understood in this context. She did not appear in a strong France, but in a broken one. And perhaps this is why her story was so powerful. For in the moment of greatest weakness, a peasant girl stood and said, "God has sent me to save France." Dear listener, reflect once more. History is not only about battles and treaties, it is about the spirit of a people. In 1429, the spirit of France was dim. The English seemed unstoppable, the king uncertain, the people weary. Into that dimness came Joan, bringing light, or at least the hope of light. In Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc, this despair is conveyed not through landscapes or armies, but through faces. Judges, soldiers, peasants, all marked by sorrow and doubt. In Luc Besson's The Messenger, France is shown as a land in ruins, desperate for deliverance. Both capture something true. Joan mattered because the world she entered was broken enough to need her. As we close this chapter, let us see the stage clearly. France divided, its king uncrowned, its armies faltering, its people weary. The 100 Years' War raged, but the end was not yet written. Into this darkness, the voices of a girl from Domrémy promised salvation. The voices that spoke to Joan in the fields of Domrémy did not leave her in peace. They pressed her, urged her, commanded her. She must go to the Dauphin Charles. She must help him reclaim his throne. She must raise the siege of Orléans. Imagine, if you will, the strangeness of this command. She was a teenage peasant girl, illiterate, unknown, with no military training, no noble lineage. And yet she believed, and more than believed, she obeyed. Her first steps were small. Around 1428, the voices grew insistent. She must leave Domrémy. She first sought help from a local garrison commander at Vaucouleurs, Robert de Baudricourt. At first he dismissed her as foolish. A girl claiming she could save France. Absurd. But Joan did not falter. She returned, persisted, gained supporters among the townsfolk. Witnesses later recalled her calm conviction, her refusal to be turned aside. She told Baudricourt that unless he sent her to the Dauphin, France would fall. Something in her determination began to persuade. Baudricourt agreed to provide an escort, and Joan, dressed in men's clothing for safety, set out on the long journey to Chinon, where the Dauphin resided. This was no simple journey. She and her companions rode through enemy territory, past towns and villages hostile to Charles, through forests and rivers. Yet they arrived safely. And here history records a striking moment. At Chinon, Joan was brought before Charles VII. To test her, he disguised himself, standing among his courtiers while another man was dressed as king. But Joan, never having seen Charles before, walked straight to him, bowed, and addressed him as the Dauphin. How could she have known? Was it insight, divine guidance, or clever observation? Whatever the case, the impression was powerful. She told Charles that God had sent her to see him crowned at Reims. She promised she would raise the siege of Orléans. Charles, cautious and uncertain, did not yet commit. He ordered theologians and bishops to examine her. At Poitiers, Joan was questioned for weeks. They found no heresy, only a young woman of remarkable confidence and piety. One chronicler reported, "They found nothing in her contrary to the faith, but much that was admirable." In the end, Charles decided to trust her. Desperate for hope, lacking other options, he gave Joan what she asked: armor, a sword, and command of troops to march to Orléans. Dear listener, pause and reflect how extraordinary this was. A peasant girl, scarcely 17, persuading nobles, priests, and a king to entrust her with armies. In an age where women rarely led in public, Joan stepped into the very heart of power. It is one of history's great marvels. Pop culture often dramatizes this meeting. In The Messenger, the story of Joan of Arc, Mila Jovovich's Joan bursts with passion and fury, hurling divine demands at reluctant nobles. In Ingrid Bergman's Joan of Arc, 1948, the scene is more reverent, bathed in holy light. But the truth, as the records suggest, was quieter and perhaps more astonishing. Joan did not persuade with spectacle, but with calm conviction. She spoke clearly, firmly, with a certainty that others found difficult to dismiss. Consider how witnesses described her. She was short, dark-haired, dressed in men's clothing, her voice steady. She claimed no special education, no noble rank. And yet she spoke to Charles as if destiny itself had appointed her. Her presence, more than argument, won her audience. Why did they believe her? Historians suggest several reasons. Charles VII was desperate, his fortunes were low, his legitimacy weak. Orléans was on the brink. Joan offered hope at a moment when hope was scarce. And she offered it with a conviction so unshakable that even skeptics began to wonder if perhaps God truly had sent her. Dear listener, imagine the hall at Chinon. The Dauphin sits, uncertain, weary of war. Courtiers whisper, skeptical, mocking. Into this hall walks a teenage girl in men's clothing, her eyes bright, her voice unwavering. She points to the king and says, "You are the true heir, and God commands you to be crowned." The hall falls silent. In that silence, the impossible seems possible. And so Joan's mission began. From Domrémy to Vaucouleurs, from Vaucouleurs to Chinon, from Chinon to Orléans. A journey not of distance only, but of faith, conviction, and courage. A girl became a messenger became a commander, and a commander would soon become a legend. As we close this chapter, let us hold the image of Joan à Chinon, small in stature, immense in spirit, standing before a king and declaring a destiny. For here, dear listener, the mission truly began. Next, we will follow her to the battlefield, the warrior maiden. At Orléans, Joan would face not kings and courtiers, but walls and swords, arrows and fire. And there she would show whether her voices spoke truth. The year was 1429. Orléans, a city on the Loire, lay under siege. For months the English had encircled it, choking its lifelines, preparing to starve it into submission. If Orléans fell, the way to the south would open, and Charles VII's cause would collapse. All France watched. It was here, at Orléans, that Joan of Arc arrived, a girl in armor bearing a banner, sent by voices she believed were divine. When Joan reached the city, she carried not only armor and sword, but something greater: hope. Contemporary accounts testify that her arrival electrified the garrison and the townspeople. The Journal du Siège d'Orléans, written by an eyewitness, records that she inspired the soldiers, giving them confidence they had not felt for months. Where before they were weary, now they felt the tide might turn. But what did Joan actually do in battle? Here, history and legend intertwine. She was not trained as a soldier, and yet she rode with the army, entered the city, and urged attacks against the English positions. She carried her banner into combat, a white standard, painted with the image of Christ in judgment, flanked by lilies. She herself later said, "I carried my banner when I went against the enemy, to avoid killing anyone. I have never killed." Her role was not to slay, but to lead, to inspire, to be the visible symbol of God's favor. At Orléans, her presence was dramatic. She urged assaults when commanders hesitated. She rallied troops who faltered. At one critical moment, she was wounded by an arrow in the shoulder. Many thought she would withdraw, but instead she returned, wounded yet undaunted, carrying her banner once more. The next day, the French captured the English fortifications, and the siege was broken. Orléans was saved. Dear listener, pause and reflect. How remarkable this was. A teenage peasant girl, not only standing beside soldiers hardened by years of war, but leading them, urging them on, embodying a vision of divine favor. Whatever we make of her voices, we cannot deny her effect. The soldiers believed, and in war, belief itself can shift the outcome. In popular imagination, Joan is often shown fighting with sword in hand, cutting down enemies. In Luc Besson's The Messenger, the story of Joan of Arc, 1999, she is fierce, violent, almost consumed by her mission. In strategy games such as Age of Empires 2, she is portrayed as a warrior unit, charging with troops. But the truth, as she herself swore, is subtler. She did not kill. She carried the banner, a rallying point, a sign that God was with them. Her strength lay not in arms, but in presence, and yet presence can be greater than force. Consider the chronicles. Jean Chartier, a contemporary historian, wrote that Joan filled the French with new courage and the English with fear. That is power, the power not of blade, but of spirit. Orléans was more than a battle, it was a turning point. Until then, Charles's cause seemed doomed. After Orléans, it seemed blessed. The people whispered of a miracle, of divine favor, of a girl sent by heaven to save France. And in a sense it was true, not because angels descended, but because Joan's courage transformed despair into hope. Dear listener, imagine the scene. The walls of Orléans are battered, the English fortifications strong, the people are weary, soldiers discouraged. Suddenly, into the city rides a young woman, clad in armor, her white banner high. She speaks with confidence, urging faith, urging courage. Soldiers rally, townspeople cheer, assaults are launched, and the English are driven back. The bells ring, fires blaze, and the city is free. In that moment, the fate of France shifts. Joan herself, when questioned at her trial, spoke of this with simplicity. Asked what she had done at Orléans, she said, "I told them I was sent by God. They had great confidence in me. They fought, and God gave them victory." To her, it was not her own doing, but God's. Yet history records that without her, Orléans might have fallen. And here lies the paradox. Was Joan a warrior? Yes, but not as pop culture often imagines. She was a warrior of spirit, of symbol, of courage. She carried no bloodied sword, but a banner of faith. And yet she stood at the very heart of battle, wounded, defiant, inspiring. She was the Maiden of Orléans, and she earned the name. Dear listener, reflect once more. In Joan we see the archetype of the unlikely savior, the one who rises from obscurity to change the fate of nations. She is David against Goliath, the child who confounds kings, the peasant who outshines nobles. Her power was not in what she killed, but in what she gave: belief, courage, vision. As we close this chapter, let us hold the image of Joan at Orléans, wounded yet unbroken, her banner high, her presence enough to turn despair into victory. From here, her path would only rise higher. The voices told her that Charles must be crowned at Reims, and she would see it done. Dear listener, Orléans had been freed. The city, once on the brink of collapse, now rang with bells of victory. For Charles VII and his followers, it was more than a military triumph. It was a sign. France, it seemed, had not been abandoned by heaven. At the center of this turn stood Joan of Arc, the teenage girl from Domrémy, whose banner had rallied soldiers and whose conviction had revived a kingdom. Yet Orléans was not the end. For Joan, her mission pointed beyond battles. Her voices told her that the Dauphin must be crowned king at Reims. Only then would France be truly restored. Why Reims? In medieval France, coronation was not merely ceremony, but sacrament. For centuries, kings of France had been anointed in Reims cathedral with holy oil said to descend from heaven itself, kept in a sacred vial. Without this rite, Charles's claim was fragile, mocked as the King of Bourges. With it, he would be recognized as the true, divinely sanctioned King of France. Reims, however, lay deep in enemy territory. The English and their Burgundian allies held the way. To march there would be bold, perhaps reckless. But Joan insisted, and Charles agreed. The march began in June 1429. Joan and the French army advanced through towns along the Loire. One by one they opened their gates. Some were taken by force, others surrendered at the sight of Joan and her banner. Chroniclers described the journey as almost miraculous. Resistance crumbled, towns that had wavered returned to Charles's cause. The people greeted Joan with joy, seeing in her a living sign of divine favor. Finally, in July, the army reached Reims. The city, faced with Joan's forces, opened its gates. On July 17, 1429, Charles was crowned King of France in the Cathedral of Reims. Joan stood beside him holding her banner. She later explained, "It had been present in toil. It was right that it should be present in triumph." Dear listener, pause and imagine the scene. The great cathedral filled with light, the sacred oil anointing Charles, the crown placed upon his head. The nobles gather, the people cheer, the bells ring across the city. And among them stands a young woman in armor, banner in hand, who only months before had been unknown, a peasant from Domrémy. She looks upon the king she has raised to his throne, and her mission is fulfilled. This moment was the pinnacle of Joan's story. In the eyes of many, it confirmed that she was indeed chosen by God. Without her, Charles might never have dared attempt the march. With her, the impossible had become real. From that day, Charles was no longer a claimant mocked as the King of Bourges, but the anointed King of France. In popular culture, this coronation is often shown as the climax. In Ingrid Bergman's Joan of Arc, 1948, it is depicted with grandeur. Joan radiant, Charles solemn. In The Messenger, the story of Joan of Arc, 1999, the moment is painted with heightened drama, almost a fever of triumph. In video games and novels, it becomes the symbol of her mission completed. And indeed, it was triumph, but the sources remind us it was also solemn, almost restrained. Joan herself spoke not of her own glory, but of the banner of God, of duty fulfilled. Reflect, dear listener, how extraordinary this must have felt. For Charles, long uncertain, now crowned. For the nobles, long wavering, now reassured. For the people, long weary, now given hope. And for Joan, the peasant girl who had seen visions in the fields, who had traveled through enemy lands, who had lifted a siege, and now stood beside a crowned king. This was the mountaintop of her destiny. Yet as often in legend, the mountaintop is not the end, but the turning point. For after Reims, Joan's path would grow harder. She longed to press on, to drive the English fully from France, to march even on Paris. But Charles, cautious, hesitant, and influenced by counselors wary of Joan's rising power, slowed the advance. Political complexities, alliances, and fears began to entangle the mission. The triumph of Reims was real, but it was also the beginning of tension. Dear listener, reflect once more. The coronation at Reims reveals the paradox of Joan's story. She succeeded gloriously in what she set out to do, but success brought new challenges, new suspicions, new obstacles. For kingdoms are not won by faith alone, but by politics, intrigue, and compromise. Joan's purity of mission, so luminous at Orléans and Reims, would soon collide with the murkier realities of power. As we close this chapter, let us linger on the vision of Reims, the cathedral alive with bells, the crown gleaming, the banner beside the king. For in that moment, France was reborn, and Joan stood at the very peak of her destiny. After the bells of Reims fell silent, the crown placed firmly upon Charles' head, Joan's mission might have seemed complete. And yet, for Joan herself, there was more to do. She believed that God had not sent her only to raise Orléans and crown a king, but to drive the English entirely from France. With burning conviction, she urged Charles to march onward, to press the advantage, to reclaim Paris, to end the war. But Charles, cautious and shaped by years of hesitation, faltered. His councillors urged caution, politics demanded compromise. France was still divided. The Burgundians, French allies of the English, were powerful. Rather than pressing to Paris with Joan's urgency, Charles sought negotiation. It was the beginning of distance between king and maiden, between faith and politics. Joan nevertheless led an attack on Paris in September 1429. The assault was fierce, and Joan, true to her spirit, pressed forward with her banner even after being wounded by a crossbow bolt. Yet the attack faltered, and Charles ordered a retreat. For Joan, this was bitter. She had crowned a king, yet he lacked the will to fulfill what she believed was God's command. From this point, her fortunes declined. She continued to fight, but her victories were smaller, her influence less certain. She grew restless, even frustrated, while Charles's court grew wary of her uncompromising zeal. By 1430, she rode to defend the city of Compiègne against the Burgundians. There, her fate would be sealed. On May 23, 1430, Joan led a sortie against Burgundian forces. She fought bravely, but as the French retreated, the gates of Compiègne closed too soon. Trapped outside, Joan was pulled from her horse and captured by Burgundian soldiers. For the first time since her rise, she was no longer free, no longer leader, no longer banner of hope, but prisoner. Dear listener, pause and reflect. How cruelly sudden this turn was. 1 year, she had lifted Orléans and crowned a king. The next, she was bound, a captive in enemy hands. It is the nature of destiny to rise and fall, but seldom with such swiftness. Her captors knew her value. The Burgundians, allied with the English, saw in her not only a prisoner, but a prize. Negotiations began. The English, eager to break her power and discredit Charles's cause, paid for her transfer. She was sold, handed over not as knight to knight, but as merchandise, as though a saint or prophet could be bought. In January 1431, Joan was delivered to Rouen, the English stronghold in Normandy. This betrayal stings even deeper when we recall the silence of Charles VII. The king Joan had crowned, the cause she had revived, made little effort to ransom or rescue her. Perhaps he lacked the means. Perhaps he feared that her capture had weakened her influence. Perhaps he found her zeal inconvenient now that he had his crown. Whatever the reason, he did not come. Joan was left alone. In popular culture, this abandonment is often emphasized. Films portray Joan as a figure betrayed by politics, deserted by the king she made. In Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc, the betrayal is shown through her loneliness, the faces of judges, the silence of her allies. In Luc Besson's The Messenger, Charles is portrayed as weak, unable to defend the woman who gave him his throne. These portrayals capture a bitter truth. Joan was not defeated on the battlefield, but by politics and abandonment. Imagine, dear listener, the sorrow of that journey. From banner and crown to chains and guarded chambers. The girl who had been cheered by thousands was now jeered by enemies. The voices that had once guided her now spoke, she said, in prison. But the world outside had turned against her. Reflect once more. Betrayal is often the fate of visionaries. Those who burn too brightly are embraced in triumph, but when triumph is secure, they are cast aside. Joan's fall reminds us that politics is wary of saints, that kings need visionaries to rise, but often discard them once thrones are won. And yet, Joan did not despair. Witnesses recall her still unbroken in spirit, still certain of her mission, even in chains. She did not recant her voices. She did not curse her fate. Instead, she prepared to face the trial that would define her, not as warrior but as heretic in the eyes of her enemies. As we close this chapter, let us hold the image of Joan at Compiègne, reaching for safety, betrayed by circumstance, seized by enemies, abandoned by her king. From that moment, her path would no longer lead to crowns or battles, but to interrogation, condemnation, and fire. Dear listener, captivity might have silenced Joan of Arc, but her enemies sought not silence alone. They sought destruction, not only of her body, but of her reputation, her mission, her very memory. And so they put her on trial, not as a prisoner of war, but as a heretic. For to condemn her as a mere soldier would not suffice. They wished to brand her dangerous, unholy, false. The trial took place at Rouen, beginning in January 1431. Presiding was Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, loyal to the English cause. Around him gathered a panel of theologians and clerics, more than 100 in all, though fewer attended at any one time. The proceedings were long, detailed, and heavily recorded, and it is from these trial transcripts that we know so much of Joan's own words. From the beginning, the trial was stacked against her. She was held in an English prison, guarded by soldiers, denied the protection normally given to ecclesiastical prisoners. She was questioned in long sessions, often without legal counsel, pressured by threats of torture. The charges against her were many: heresy, witchcraft, blasphemy, wearing men's clothing, claiming divine revelation without church sanction. And yet, dear listener, in this hostile court, Joan astonished. Again and again, the transcripts record her intelligence, her quick wit, her courage. Asked whether she was in God's grace, she replied, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God so keep me." It was a brilliant answer, humble, devout, yet unassailable. To claim certainty would have been arrogance. To deny it would have admitted guilt. Instead, she spoke with wisdom that silenced her accusers. Time after time, Joan turned questions back upon her judges. Asked if her voices had told her she would be delivered from prison, she said, "I do not know when I shall be delivered, but I entrust it to God." Asked why she wore men's clothing, she explained that it was for protection among soldiers, a practical necessity, not a sin. Her answers, preserved in ink, reveal a girl of only 19, holding her own against trained clerics and scholars. Dear listener, pause and reflect. Imagine her in that chamber, chained, surrounded by hostile faces, her life hanging on every word. Yet she spoke with clarity, courage, even flashes of humor. She was no puppet, no naive child, but a presence as formidable in words as she had been in battle. In art and film, the trial has been a favored subject. Carl Theodor Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc, 1928, remains one of cinema's most powerful portrayals. Nearly the entire film is set during the trial, shot in stark close-ups, capturing the agony and the luminous defiance on Joan's face. Maria Falconetti's performance as Joan is remembered as one of the greatest in film history, trembling, luminous, yet unbroken. Luc Besson's The Messenger, 1999, by contrast, paints the trial as chaotic, haunted, Joan tormented by doubt as well as faith. Both show us how artists have imagined this moment, either as holy endurance or as inner struggle. Yet the transcripts tell us something else. Joan was steady. Her torment was real, but her answers show a mind unshaken. If she doubted, she did not let it rule her speech. If she feared, she did not let it silence her. Still, the outcome was never in doubt. The judges sought condemnation, not justice. By May 1431, they had compiled charges against her, that she falsely claimed divine revelation, that she dressed as a man, that she disobeyed the church. Joan at first signed an abjuration, pressured by fear of execution. But within days she withdrew it, declaring she could not deny what she knew to be true. To live by denying her voices was, to her, worse than death, and so the sentence was sealed. Joan of Arc was declared heretic, relapsed, excommunicated. She would burn. Dear listener, reflect once more. The trial of Joan is one of history's great ironies, for her judges sought to destroy her, but instead they preserved her words. It is because they recorded every answer that we know her voice today. They sought to brand her false, but her courage in the face of their traps made her a figure of admiration for centuries. In condemning her, they made her immortal. As we close this chapter, let us see Joan not only as victim, but as victor. She stood before learned men, armed with nothing but conviction, and she matched them word for word. They condemned her body, but her spirit shines still. After months of questioning, after the trap of the abjuration and her refusal to deny her voices, Joan's fate was sealed. The court at Rouen declared her a heretic, a relapsed sinner, outside the mercy of the church. The sentence was death by fire. It was May 30th, 1431. Joan was 19 years old. The English authorities wished for her death to be public, a spectacle to crush her influence, to humiliate her cause, to erase the idea that God had ever spoken through her. For this reason, they chose the marketplace of Rouen, a place where thousands could gather to watch. Eyewitnesses were present, not only soldiers and townspeople, but clerics, scribes, chroniclers. It is from their accounts that we know what happened that day. Joan was led from her prison in the castle of Rouen. She was dressed in a simple gown, her hair shorn. Some accounts say she wept, others that she prayed quietly. She was brought before a sermon, where once again she was denounced as heretic. Then she was handed to the secular arm, the English soldiers, to be executed. They built the stake high, with wood piled thick. She was tied to the post, a crucifix held before her. According to the eyewitness Jean Massieu, she asked that a cross be raised where she could see it. A sympathetic English soldier made one hastily from 2 sticks and handed it to her. She held it close to her breast as the flames were prepared. When the fire was lit, Joan cried out the name of Jesus. Witnesses recalled that she called upon him repeatedly, her voice carrying through the crowd. Even her enemies were moved. The English chronicler recorded that she spoke the name of Jesus until her voice could no longer be heard. Many said she died with his name on her lips. Dear listener, pause and reflect. How different this is from the image we often carry. In popular imagination, the burning of Joan is sometimes shown with fire and fury, a blaze of spectacle, screams of defiance. But the record shows something quieter, something more solemn. A girl praying, crying Jesus' name, steadfast in her faith until the end. And yet, spectacle it was. The fire consumed her body, but not her memory. So powerful was the impression of her death that even some of her judges later expressed remorse. The secretary of the English king, present at Rouen, is said to have murmured, "We are lost, we have burned a saint." Pop culture has returned to this scene again and again. In Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc, 1928, the execution is shown in searing close-ups. Falconetti's face luminous with terror and transcendence. In The Messenger, the story of Joan of Arc, 1999, Luc Besson portrays it as chaotic, filled with horror, Joan consumed by voices and flame. In paintings across centuries, the moment is frozen. Joan bound, fire rising, eyes lifted heavenward. Each portrayal is different, yet all seek to capture the paradox. A teenage girl dying in fire, yet unbroken in spirit. Imagine standing in that square. The smell of smoke, the roar of flame, the crowd pressing close. In the midst of it, a young woman tied to the stake, her lips moving in prayer. Her enemies thought to erase her, but instead they immortalized her. For from that fire, a legend was born. Reflect once more. Death by fire was meant to shame, to obliterate, but Joan's death did the opposite. She became martyr, saint in the eyes of the people. Within decades, her trial was re-examined, her name cleared. Centuries later, she would be canonized by the church that had once condemned her. Her death at Rouen, intended to end her story, became the reason it endured. As we close this chapter, let us hold the image of Joan at the stake, not in fury, but in faith. Her body perished, but her name lives, carried by history, by art, by the whispers of those who still see her as chosen. Joan of Arc's body was reduced to ash in the marketplace of Rouen, but her story did not end in smoke. In a sense, it was only beginning. For legends do not perish with the flesh. They grow, they transform, they echo across centuries. Joan, the girl who heard voices, who crowned a king, who died in fire, became more than a figure of her time. She became a symbol, reinterpreted, reshaped, reborn again and again. Within a generation, doubts arose about the justice of her trial. By 1456, only 25 years after her death, the church reopened the case. Witnesses from Domrémy, soldiers from Orléans, clerics who had seen her condemned, were called to testify. The outcome was clear. Joan was declared innocent, her trial unjust, her condemnation nullified. Those who had orchestrated her death were condemned instead. The girl once branded heretic was now declared faithful daughter of the church. From that moment, Joan's legend only grew. To the French, she became not only martyr, but national heroine, the Maid of Orléans. Chroniclers celebrated her deeds, poets sang of her courage. During the long struggles between France and England, her memory was invoked as proof that God favored the French crown. As centuries passed, Joan's image shifted with the needs of each age. In the Romantic era of the 19th century, she became the muse of poets and painters. Friedrich Schiller wrote a play, Die Jungfrau von Orléans. Jules Michelet, the French historian, called her the most extraordinary person of her age. Ingres painted her in luminous prayer. Rossetti imagined her as ethereal and tragic. Each artist saw in Joan what their time desired: innocence, patriotism, mysticism, defiance. In the modern age, Joan became saint. The Catholic Church beatified her in 1909 and canonized her in 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her death. Today, she is one of the patron saints of France. Her feast day is celebrated on May 30th, the day of her execution. To believers, she is not merely heroine but intercessor, a saint who still listens to prayers. Pop culture too has kept her alive. In cinema, she has been reborn again and again. Carl Theodor Dreyer, as the Passion of Joan of Arc, 1928, remains one of the most celebrated films in history, a silent masterpiece that captured her suffering and her luminous strength. Ingrid Bergman portrayed her in 1948, embodying both innocence and conviction. Mila Jovovich took up the role in The Messenger, the story of Joan of Arc, 1999, fierce and tormented. In music, Leonard Cohen sang of her in haunting verse. In anime and games, such as Fate, Apocrypha, and Age of Empires 2, she appears as warrior, saint, avatar. Joan lives not only in churches and cathedrals, but in screens and songs, in pixels and paint. Dear listener, pause and reflect. How many figures in history have endured so widely, so deeply, so variously? Joan is warrior and saint, patriot and mystic, feminist icon and national symbol. To some, she is the pure maiden of faith. To others, the tragic victim of politics. To others still, the rebellious girl who defied men and kings. She is all of these, and more. What does this tell us? The Joan-esque story speaks to archetypes as deep as time. The innocent who confronts the mighty, the visionary condemned by the blind, the martyr whose death becomes seed of new life. In every age, we see ourselves in her. Our courage, our conviction, our suffering, our longing to believe that even the lowliest may change the world. Imagine, dear listener, Joan not as ashes in Rouen, but as light moving through the centuries. She walks through cathedrals, through battlefields, through films and songs, through dreams and prayers. She is never only of the 15th century, she is of all ages. And now, as our telling draws to a close, let us rest. The fire has faded, the cathedral bells are silent, the voices that guided Joan have grown still, yet her memory endures, luminous as ever. She lives in history, in art, in faith, in the quiet hearts of those who whisper her name. Close your eyes. The story of Joan of Arc is not only of war and death, but of courage, vision, and hope. May her flame, once meant to destroy, remind us instead of the strength of spirit, the power of conviction, the mystery of voices that call us to something greater. Sleep well, dear listener. May your dreams be gentle, and may you too carry a little of Joan's light into the night. Good night.